Okay, as many of you know, I am Jim McDonald. I'm a professor of anthropology and dean of humanities and social sciences at Southern Utah University. And the title of my talk this evening is Competing Forms of Governance and the Nation State. Let me begin by reading a brief abstract, and then I'll break down the talk into 4 basic points, and then we'll launch into some slides. The nation state is a dominant central construct in contemporary political thought and analysis from an academic and policy perspective. The nation state provides a powerful lens through which cross-cultural understandings of complex geopolitical fields are studied and understood. That is, much of our global political analysis assumes the presence of the state. In Western thought, the nation-state can be traced back to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which defined it as autonomous, sovereign, and territorially bounded. States were endowed with legitimacy, a formal international diplomatic voice, and they alone could wage war on their counterparts. Privileging the nation-state has certain powerful implications for our ability to comprehend and analyze geopolitical complexity in non- and anti-state formats. Contemporary geopolitics is often characterized by disruption, disjuncture, and unpredictability. And equally often, those political processes play out through alternative forms of governance within, at the margins of, and outside of the nation-state. A range of these political spaces will be outlined, and the implications of the Westphalian approach will be considered when attempting to understand the political other operating in a world of fuzzy politics. Anthropology is uniquely positioned to begin to understand these alternative systems of governance through a cross-cultural, fine-grained ethnography that is frequently conducted on the fluid political margins. The presentation concludes with a discussion of 2 cases, Mexico and Guatemala, in which powerful alternative forms of governance are operative. The talk itself is broken down into 4 pieces. I'm going to outline and sketch out the origins of the modern Western nation-state through the Treaty of Westphalia and Westphalian concepts of sovereignty. Then I begin to problematize the state, trouble and challenges all around for which we are conceptually and practically not well equipped to study. I'll then lay out challenges to governance, and they are multiple. And I'll move fairly quickly through those slides, but I think I need to sort of lay out the complexity of the political fields that we're finding ourselves in today. And then I'll refract that discussion through 2 case examples where I've done sustained field work, Mexico and Guatemala. And so then you might say, well, why this topic? And I would make the argument that anthropology has actually a very, very long history of research working in non-state contexts. And in fact, contemporary work often finds us on those fluid political margins. And then finally, my contact, in fact, with those sort of alternative political spaces. And so let's start with Westphalia. This was a peace treaty that was signed in 1648 after multiple devastating long wars that were being fought throughout Europe. And it very much crystallizes the concept of sovereignty, autonomy, and the territorial bounded nation state. And today, Westphalia is absolutely at the root of Western conceptualizations and practices of international relations and diplomacy, albeit in a highly abstracted form. It places, in fact, all value on the sovereign state as legitimate and effective, and it assumes that only states can conduct war against other states. And just to put this in a little bit of perspective, and by Moroccan historical standards, the state has a rather shallow history in many ways, at least in its contemporary form. And so it's useful to remember that in 1900 there were around 48 states, at least in the contemporary sense of it. By 1945, 51 states founded the United Nations. Now that's a bit of a skewed number because, of course, the losers in World War II were excluded from the table. And then we have 193 states making up the United Nations. So the contemporary states are really, by and large, fairly new. Now, all around us, we find states that are in many, many ways struggling and faltering. All you have to do is pick up any newspaper and the stories are in fact splashed across the front page. And the fragility of many, many states comes from a wide variety of different forces. So we could talk about loss of physical control and the use of legitimate physical force, the loss of legitimate authority to make collective and binding decisions, reasonable access to such things as public services, infrastructure, and security, or the inability to legitimately interact with others in the international community. And to this we might add other very, very pressing forces on states, such as levels of poverty, demographic pressure, corruption, economic growth or its lack, violence, human rights abuses, and many other things. All these measures are problematic in their own ways, but the point is not to argue about the analytical power of, but rather to ask the question, how, in fact, do these different forces combine themselves and lead to, in some cases, incredible instability in nation states? So 2 points need to be made here. One is that states are often less than robust and do not support their citizenry along a wide variety of measures. And secondly, weak states are open to contestation and challenge from other competing forms of governance that will challenge or attempt to co-opt them. If we go to a very recent policy brief, this is a United States policy brief, Global Trends 2025, they paint a pretty interesting, complex, and somewhat grim picture of future geopolitics. First, they point to problems of resources, which will lead to all kinds of instability, demographic pressure, economic volatility, geopolitical rivalries, and new and unstable state-level players. And they characterize this collectively as unpredictable discontinuities. They also note that there are multiple alternative forms of governance challenging states. And they see these potentially displacing states. And if you look at the summary of their argument, basically they say, we understand there's complexity out there, we don't really know how to understand it, let alone engage it. And so Westphalia simply doesn't give us a language or framework to understand or address these discontinuities. And so here's a list of different kinds of geopolitical alternatives that challenge and disrupt the state. These are geopolitical anomalies, failed and failing states, ungoverned or permissive environments, anti-establishment entities, shadow governments and economies, religious and ethnic diasporas, displaced people and refugees, and multipolarity in loose networks. And I'm going to take each one of these in turn and unpack it a little bit, just to give you a sense of the complexity. This is perhaps my favorite slide of all time. I try to slip it in every presentation I do. It's of contemporary geopolitical anomalies, and I realize you can't really read the detail in the slide, but you get the idea. There's a lot of them out there. And the area that I'm going to be talking about this evening, if you go right up to the top, it says narco territories, and it's pointing right at Mexico. And that's of these geopolitical anomalies that challenge us in our ability to govern. Next, we could turn to the problem of failed and failing states. And in this discussion, I don't mean to sort of open up that very complex discussion. I simply use this slide to point out that there are a lot of states, for a wide variety of reasons, that are extremely challenged right now. Many, many different forces are converging on them, and the pressures are, in fact, quite extreme. And the number of challenged states seems to be growing every year as geopolitics shifts around. So this map will look different in 2013. Hopefully, the red areas have not expanded. But I should point out that the failed state index, which I'm not a particular fan of, uses an extremely broad analytical brush. It lumps together all kinds of things in its metrics, including economic growth, corruption, violence, human rights abuses, access to services, levels of foreign aid. It lumps together all kinds of different states that aren't necessarily comparable. So there are such things as states with too much state, like North Korea. There are incredible problems of comparability. So North Korea clearly has different issues from, say, Ivory Coast. Some countries are quite unstable, yet rank surprisingly well, like Albania at 118, and Guatemala, where I've done work, at 87. And in fact, the index gets very rapidly and easily politicized. So my point simply is there are many, many challenged states out in the world. And then there are ungoverned and permissive spaces. And in fact, the label ungoverned space really is not sort of an adequate descriptor. In fact, those ungoverned spaces are typically governed just not by state entities, right? There are other alternatives that have flowed in and are, in fact, governing. We may not like them, but they're governing. So it's these are very imprecise labels. There is, in fact, network governance that links transnational distribution networks, and this operates in such wildly different venues as the world of fashion, all the way to drug and human trafficking. And there are establishment networks, everything from cartels, organized crime, street gangs, smugglers of all kind, police, military, and paramilitary. They all have absolutely one thing in common, and that is they gravitate towards environments where there are weak or failing states. And in fact, the social networks they construct very much create the scaffolding for all of their transactions. Think of many of these entities as looking like the smuggling version of Facebook. And I thought I would just toss in a slide focusing on the challenges in North Africa and the Sahel. And so here we see a number of areas within, our immediate geographic reach where the challenges are, in fact, quite pronounced. And so it is very much, as you are extremely well aware, right on the doorstep of Morocco, and it appears to be inside the door as well. So the challenges are great. I want to turn next to shadow governments, and I've chosen to highlight here one particular instance that I'm very familiar with, which is Mexico. And the map I've got here is outlining self-defense militias that are now popping up all over the country. The numbers here do not reflect the actual numbers on the map. But indeed, in Mexico, many states are fully under the control of cartels who've set up shadow governments. Citizen militias, what they call autodefensas, are responding to cartel control and, in fact, attempting to regain their own autonomy and form yet another layer of shadow government. And they absolutely point to the failure of federal and state security in Mexico. There are also shadow and informal economies. And these range everywhere from things like unlicensed taxi drivers and street vendors to drug dealers doing business on the street corner. The bottom line is shadow economies are composed of anyone who does legal or illegal work off the books. Economist Friedrich Schneider, for the 2004-2005 time frame, argues that 76 developing countries have over a third of their economy in the informal sector, in the shadow economy. 19 East and Central Asian countries have, again, well over a third of their economy in the informal sector. Perhaps even more shocking is when we look at 25 high-income economies have 15% tied up in the informal sector. And in the case of high-income economies, you've got people that are trying to duck out from under tax burdens, Social Security contributions, and other kinds of labor market regulations. So the informal and shadow economy is thriving in the global market. And so here's just a quick graphic of how this arrays globally. We could argue, again, individual cases and the precision of the measures used, but you get an idea. It's quite pervasive worldwide. We could also look at religious and ethnic diasporas as yet another challenge to states. We have 800,000 new refugees in 2011. So the levels, and that's, by the way, was a record year, the levels of human displacement are amazing as we enter the 21st century. Overall, we've got 4.6 people in 2011, though not necessarily all refugees. Overall, Afghanistan ranks #1, followed by Iraq, then Somalia, the Sudan, and Congo. The largest increases are in the Ivory Coast, 270%. Libya comes in at almost 90%. Of course, women and children are the most vulnerable in these kinds of human movements and displacements. And at the end of 2011, overall in the world, we had 15.2 million refugees, 26.4 million internally displaced people, and almost 900,000 seeking asylum. So the levels of human movement are really astounding and very hard to conceptualize. So too, if we look at internally displaced people, people are definitely on the move within the boundaries of nation states as well. And there's a map of refugees. So you get the idea. Tremendous, tremendous human displacement and instability. And then the final dimension of challenges to the state come from what is now being called multipolarity and loose networks. We're shifting, and we have been shifting for quite some time, from a model of bipolarity, which was sort of a Cold War artifact where the US and the West was pitted against the Soviet bloc, and enter new multipolarity, where you've got multiple very powerful economies that are competing against one another in a wide variety of ways. So we can point to China, India, Russia, Brazil, Sub-Saharan Africa. Many, many very vigorous and powerful economies are creating incredible complexity, economic complexity in the world. Going right along with that, we've got the emergence of very cloud-like loose networks. And these loose networks are oftentimes grabbed by international organized crime that establish, again, social network-like linkages globally. So think of the networks established by the likes of Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, the Taliban, as they move outward from their power centers. And this now gets me to the cases. And so I want to refract this discussion through case material from Mexico and Guatemala. So here's a map of Mexico. I'm just going to point out the area where I work, which is coastal. I work in central west Mexico. So essentially right here. And this is the sort of the standard rendering of Mexico. We could rewrite this map in many, many different ways. And I'm just going to show you one version here in just a minute. But the key question facing Mexico, and it has been posed multiple times, is whether Mexico really is best thought of now as a narco state, as a drug trafficking state effectively controlled by cartels. One quick key question I always ask of the parts of Mexico where I work is, who's in control? And if the answer comes back anything other than the state government and the authorities, we know we've got some problems. Let me give you a quick overview of Mexico. Political scientist George Grayson argues that Mexico is too institutionally complex to become a true narco state. But we have to remind ourselves that the cartels have a number of things that they've recently accomplished. First, they've militarily attacked all levels of state security and, in fact, unleashed in many parts of the country ruthless violence and terror. They've also corrupted and interpenetrated police and the entire security system. They've also completely interpenetrated the political system as well. They have absolutely silenced the media, and the media is now self-censoring out of fear. Journalists are essentially fair game for the cartels. They've also, quite interestingly, created a social base and a shadow government, or shadow governments throughout the country. So they are, in fact, in many ways, replacing the state in terms of social service, as well as government-like activities. Some people I've talked to have described it in the following way. They've said, we're terrified of the cartels, but they're the only people we can go to when we need to get things done. And then finally, they are diversifying economically into all types of both legal and illegal activity. And so their reach is really pervasive throughout Mexico, and they're acting in ways that go well beyond just being a form of organized crime. And so the Mexican drug war, I don't know how far it's sort of penetrated into the media here, but the Mexican drug war in 2007. And there was a major militarization to stop cartel threats to sovereignty to the federal government. In fact, the first state that was occupied is the state where I work, which is a place called Michoacan. And the president, I think at the time, made the very realistic analysis that the cartels had become so powerful that they were absolutely a threat to federal state sovereignty. And so in go the troops. Up escalates violence, and to date, over 60,000 people have been killed since 2007 in Mexico. It's estimated that 60% of the police are under cartel control, and there are, by admission of the government, 233 zones of impunity, essentially zones where the government has absolutely no control. Now, in the war on the cartels, numerous high-level cartel operatives have in fact been killed or captured. So there have been some inroads against the cartels. It's a highly controversial move on the part of the government. I can tell you that the Mexican citizenry has drug war fatigue. They are both terrorized and exhausted. And so there's tremendous sentiment among the Mexican populace sort of against the drug war. But what the government was doing, I think, is very, very clear. They were attempting to balkanize the cartels. By that, I mean they were attempting to break them into smaller units that were more easily controlled militarily, and that would then begin to compete with one another over all manner of kind of territory and control, so that internal fighting would then further weaken them. And that does, in fact, appear to have been the case. So they are now reconfigured into smaller and more localized groups, at least in some cases, and the threat to the federal government has been reduced. This is, in fact, reinforced by cartels at the local level now competing over drug distribution and local criminal activity. And so the violence is escalated between these smaller cartel groups, and the focus has moved away from the federal government. And so here's one rewriting of the map of Mexico. Forget state boundaries, forget highways, forget all of the usual geopolitical information we see on standard political maps. And this is a window onto who really controls Mexico. And so this lays out where the various cartels are operating, the routes, the drug routes they from Colombia into Central America, into Mexico, into the United States, which is a major consumer. The really frightening part here is that those little white spaces that you see on the map are not, in fact, spaces that are necessarily controlled by the government. They're just being disputed by the cartels. And so you can expect those to be highly violent places. And so the cartels essentially cover the entirety of the country. So let me do a quick summary of Mexico. Here we have what they euphemistically call anti-establishment entities, effectively cartels operating as competing forms of governance. They grew out of an extremely permissible environment, and in many regions this remains true today. They've created shadow governments and economies in which all manner of trafficking, extortion, piracy, and terrorism are occurring, and they use legitimate business holdings to launder money and diversify. There's also a new kind of loose network multipolarity going on in Mexico. We know that transnational crime generates about, in Mexico, that number is a staggering 13 billion in drug trafficking and other kinds of activity. So increasingly, loose networks are beginning to emerge. They're less hierarchical, and they sort of mimic social network-like webs of operatives across the globe, so that cartels in Mexico are connected throughout Latin America into the United States, and they're reaching into Europe and Africa. So we're moving from a label of drug trafficking organization to a label of transnational criminal organization for these organizations. Here's a quick graphic, very aesthetic graphic, a quick graphic of these transnational movements and flows. The different colors represent different kinds of illegal activity. One that particularly catches my attention is the move from the Andean region here, right here. I'm guessing that's Guinea-Bissau. I would put money on it where that's landing. And then from Guinea-Bissau, and by the way, the green is cocaine. And you have a movement right up through Morocco into Spain. Right, so there you go. The world is an interconnected place in terms of transnational crime. Their reach is impressive. From a Mexican perspective, you can see just the shock waves of their loose networks reaching out and moving their way pretty quickly towards Europe. And that gets us to Guatemala. In some ways, it's a much weaker state than Mexico. It's much more fragile. The area where I work is here in the Central Highlands, a very mountainous, high-altitude area, generally populated with Mayan Indians. Guatemala has effectively been invaded and largely taken over by the Mexican cartels, who find it very easy to operate there. It's an extremely permissive environment. There's very little security to stop them. Now, let me give you a little Guatemala background. We could ask ourselves, is it a failing state or an endemic violent democracy? And a very serious argument has been made that Guatemala is a sort of classic Latin American violent democracy. Every 6 years they elect a new president. The president occupies a very weak government, and essentially violence oscillates. Sometimes it's used by the state to repress people they don't like. Sometimes you get reactions to the state. More violence ensues. So here's a little background. In 1954, the modestly liberal Jacobo Arbenz government is overthrown in a coup d'etat. The Arbenz government was attempting some extremely modest land reforms, as well as attempts to include the Maya into the political life of the country. From 1960 to 1996, you get 36 years of unbroken, bloody civil war, in which 250,000 Maya were either murdered or disappeared. Between 1982 and 1983, there was actually a scorched earth campaign and a genocide carried out against the Maya by then dictator Efraín Ríos Montt, who was recently tried and who was found guilty, and in fact, the case was overturned on a technicality. So post-Civil War, what do we have in Guatemala? You have an extremely small, weak central government versus a very powerful, what they call the occult or hidden powers. Those hidden powers are everything from wealthy landowners to conservative businessmen and industry owners to the military to organized crime. There's a general lack of social support, so there's no health care infrastructure, relatively little education, and no security. There's also a lack of basic infrastructure in terms of roads, sanitation, water, and the power grid. So effectively, the wealthy and the elite in Guatemala get their health care in places like Houston, Texas. They get their educations in Mexico or the United States. And they buy their own security, their own private security. If the power goes out, they just fire up the generators, and everybody else is left to fend for themselves. Between 1996, which was the end of the Civil War and the start of democratic government in Guatemala, between 1996 and 2011, government size actually shrunk by almost 30%. And Guatemala has the smallest public budget of any country in Central America. It's not the poorest country in Central America, but it has the smallest public budget. So their public budget is 15% of its GDP, whereas the average is almost 30%. So there's very little public spending on the broader citizenry in Guatemala. And in terms of security, it's non-existent security. The cartels and organized crime control over 60% of the country. States of siege, what they call states of siege, essentially martial law, was declared in 2010 in the northern state of Alta Verapaz because the cartels were terrorizing the citizenry. Another state of siege or martial law was declared in 2011 in the Petén, yet even further north and completely controlled by cartels. And most recently, there was martial law declared in the state of Jalapa because people were protesting against a large mining corporation. And so the state actually turned against its own citizens in that case. All of these states of siege have had very little effect on much of anything. You have, in the place of political violence, you have it replaced by an even more diffuse social violence. So if during the Civil War you effectively knew where the threat was, military and police, in the post-Civil War years, violence is much more diffuse. You never know where it's coming from, and it has escalated rapidly. Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador collectively are the most violent place on the face of the earth. So if you would vote for Afghanistan or Iraq, you're wrong. Central America is it. And then this is really very much marked by the imposition of a UN Anti-Impunity Commission in 2006. It's the only place outside of Eastern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa where the UN has set up an Anti-Impunity Commission. And they're charged with investigating crime. They prosecute through the Guatemalan system, and they've been extremely effective. They have busted politicians right and left. They've also managed to sort of reconstruct, to some extent, the police force. And so to summarize Guatemala, it has anti-establishment entities galore. It has the hidden powers, ex-military, the business, essentially run the country. You have the military, the police, and the paramilitaries that are operative, and I was always told when I was there, never engage a policeman. They're more dangerous and unpredictable than the crooks. And you also have the cartels that are organizing all level of crime. So huge presence of anti-establishment entities. It is an extremely permissive environment with many quote-unquote ungoverned zones. They're actually governed by cartels and gangs. There's a massive shadow economy of drugs and other trafficking, as well as lesser informal economies. And there are loose networks very much at work in Guatemala, where the Mexican cartels are contracting with Guatemalan organized crime to traffic drugs through Guatemala into Mexico. And so there's yet again another snapshot of a country where, by and large, it's not the state that's in control. And that's where I'll leave it this evening. I'd be happy to take any questions, but it is a good reminder that in many, many parts of the world, in fact, it's not the state that has the most powerful presence. It's these multiple other. Thank you very much.